Okay, so here we are. Officially welcome to our February webinar. This evening, we will be talking about triggers and skin picking, which is a topic that you selected last month. There's a poll active currently, so you can select the topic for March. If you have any suggestions for topics, something that you'd like to hear about, but it's not listed in the topics that were proposed for this month, put them in the Q&A portion, and next month I will put them in the poll so you can choose them. So without further ado, let's get started. So this is some of the topics that we will be talking about tonight. So what are triggers? As always, we have to define what we're talking about. Then we'll find different ways to classify triggers, and this will help us later on understand them better. We will talk about why are triggers, or rather, why is it that triggers trigger us? We'll talk about the connection between triggers and experiential avoidance. And then briefly, we will try to sum up the everything that we talked about in something that's useful and hopefully practical for you, which is what to do about triggers. This topic, so this is one of the topics that you proposed very frequently, and last time, obviously, you voted for it. And initially I thought, well, this will be very easy because, I mean, surely there has to be a lot written about this topic because it is very important. But to my surprise, there was really not a lot of materials to work with. So I ended up basically summarizing things that I get from my clients, and then also adding, of course, a little bit of psychology in it and arranging it in that way. One of the articles that I came across searching for it is this one on the right, which is, should art come with trigger warnings? Obviously, it's a different topic, but that tells you about the level of literature that was available. It was an interesting article, and it actually gave me some inspiration for the webinar as well. So let's get started. First, let's define what is it that we're talking about when we talk about triggers. Otherwise, when you Google triggers, you get trigger warnings in art or anything else. So when we talk about triggers in general, we talk about any event that activates a certain behavioral pattern, right? So in theory, many things, almost anything can be a trigger. In the case of skin picking specifically, because obviously we have to adjust a definition as vague as this. So when we talk about skin picking, when we talk about triggers, we're actually talking about anything that allows the urge to arise. So something that seemingly creates the urge, or at least activates it, or something that will immediately cause you to begin picking your skin. So these are sort of two broad categories of events that we're dealing with. But generally speaking, a trigger can really be anything. I guess even you can even have good triggers, because behavioral patterns don't have to necessarily be bad. We usually talk about them when they cause some sort of pain to us, but otherwise a trigger is just anything that activates a certain pattern that you have. So what are some common triggers for skin picking? I was also looking for lists and studies about this, but I found none. So I basically took, when I was making the presentation, I took all the things that my clients mentioned as triggers in those few days that I was sort of assembling the PowerPoint. So here are they. I will quickly go through the list and won't read everything because there's a lot. So anxiety, boredom, conflict, public speaking, the way that their skin looks, sometimes painful memories, ruminating on something, feeling overwhelmed, restlessness, guilt, shame, being assessed by someone or potentially being assessed by someone can also be triggering. Then mirrors, phones, laptops, uncomfortable chairs, social media, having to go to work, public speaking, indecision. They're literally, when you think about it, anything can trigger you. In fact, as I was going through the list, you may have thought that some of these triggers are actually the same trigger, which, if it were the case, I would have obviously written them as one. For example, one thing that came to my mind when I was looking at this is that there's the way that the skin looks, and then there's mirrors as well. Because obviously what triggers people is their reflection in the mirror, not, I don't know, the quality of the glass or something. But then I realized that when I was sort of carefully reading what my clients are writing, I realized that these are quite different. Sometimes people will not be triggered by their way their skin looks. Like even if they know that it doesn't look perfect, unless they actually see it, they won't find it triggering. On the other hand, not every mirror is often a trigger. Sometimes mirrors in the bathrooms are triggers, but for example, not mirrors in bedrooms. And what usually will be the difference is whether or not a person is alone, and also sort of generally, what that room represents and what is it used for, and also very frequently light. So whether or not something will be a trigger is very much an individual thing. And as much as I wanted to assemble a list, it was nearly impossible. So I decided to take all this and some other stuff that I couldn't fit into one slide, and then find different ways to classify them. Ways that might, because my thinking was, if I'm providing a list of triggers for people, or if I'm classifying them in some way to make it easier to talk about them, this should be a classification that will actually help people discover and understand their triggers better. So here's what I came up with. Oh, I see some of you are raising your hands. You can ask anything you want to know in the Q&A. And of course, as always, once I'm done with the webinar, I will go through all your questions and answer as many of them as I possibly can. So let's play a little bit of classifications. So there's a very obvious way to start, which is that triggers can be internal or external. If you look at the list previously, some triggers are thoughts, their memories, their emotions, body sensations, right? So these would all be internal triggers. It's something that happens inside our heads, whereas triggers can also be external. That would be, I don't know, mirrors that I mentioned, or fear of other people and whether or not they will judge you, or fear of being rejected. So these can be all external because they depend on actions of other people, right? As you will see when we continue with this boundary is a very relative one. Ultimately, I would say every trigger is an internal trigger, and hopefully I will convince you of this by the time I end the webinar. But for practical purposes, when you're trying to discover and learn about skin picking, this is a very useful distinction, because when you start the program, or if you do something on your own, you will usually start with habit reversal training, which is a very practical behavioral intervention. So in that context, it really is very important whether or not the trigger is something out there in the world, or if the trigger is something, inside your head, because you will not apply the same technique. You can cover your mirrors, for example. That would be a type of stimulus control. And then if you don't see your reflection in the mirror, you're very likely not to be triggered. But if your main trigger is, I don't know, an emotion, you can't really cover up emotions, because every time we try to do that, we just end up with skin picking or worse. So this distinction is practically quite important. And this is a very good place to start if you're just now learning about what triggers you. Internal triggers then can be emotional or cognitive. Uh, I'm not quite happy with how I define this, but I think it's useful for now. So basically, internal triggers can be thoughts. So you can be, let's say, thinking about everything that you have to do, or thinking about everything that you're not going to have time to do, or you can simply remember things, right? So as long as it's in the form of thoughts, we can say that it's a cognitive internal trigger, right? And if it's an emotion, then sadness can also trigger you. So this is basically, and oftentimes they can be a combination. If you're triggered by a painful memory, that's both at the same time, right? There's the affective component, and then there's also the cognitive component. But essentially, this distinction is important to us, because we will apply different techniques if we want to cope with triggers that are more emotional, or if we want to cope with triggers that are cognitive. There are techniques, if for those of you who are in the program, session 6 techniques are specifically the ones that I'm talking about, techniques that have to do with cognitive diffusion, distancing from your thoughts, rephrasing and reframing the thoughts. All these are very useful when it comes to thoughts that trigger you, but when it comes to emotions, well, less so. And the reason why it's less useful is because you can't really argue with a feeling, right? So then these triggers need to be approached in a different way. The way that I like to differentiate these two things is that they simply speak different languages. Speaking English to an emotion is basically like trying to get by in English in Italy. Like, just not going to happen. It just doesn't work because your emotions don't speak the same language. So if you want to deal with your emotions, then you have to learn to speak the language that they understand. Hence the difference between these two triggers, right? So then external triggers can be objects, people, or behavior. Objects such as mirrors, for example, people such as your partner or your boss, or just any random person, depending on what is it about them that triggers you, right? Or certain behaviors can be triggering. For example, if you um, it's like if you're doing something and you expect yourself to do it perfectly, the fact that you faltered 1% of the time will be enough to trigger you. Sometimes behaviors of other people will trigger your picking as well. The words that they say, it's also an act, so it's type of behavior. Or sometimes even their nonverbal communication can be a trigger. So when you see a person looking at you a certain way, that can be triggering if you're assuming that they're looking at your skin, for example, or if they're looking with disapproval, right? So there's something out there in their behavior that will cause you to feel the urge to pick. Uh, Urges can be self-focused or other-focused. So, for example, your skin or the condition of your skin can be a trigger because of what you need it to be, or because what other people need it to be. Your performance at work can be triggering because you want to do as best as you can, and then you set, let's say, unreasonably high criteria for yourself, but you do it for yourself. Or if you're a perfectionist, then they're other focused. If you remember from our webinar on perfectionism, when they're other focused, then it has nothing to do with you. It's always what would be a failure in the eyes of other people. This is also quite an important distinction, especially because of what I just mentioned, which is perfectionism, which is always other focused. Even though it may seem like it's self-focused, fundamentally perfectionism is never I want to be perfect because I really love my job. It's usually I really want to be perfect because I don't want to let down X, Y, or Z person. And then they can be situated in the present or they can be imaginary. I have to say that this is a bit of a strange formulation on my part, but let me explain what I meant. So it's something that would be a present trigger would be, let's say that my boss is standing in front of me and I'm terrified of my boss. So if my boss is right here in front of me, which he isn't, I'm alone, that can be triggering. So that would be a very real trigger. If you see a blemish or a pimple, that's a very real trigger in the present moment. An imaginary trigger would be when you're afraid of failing an exam. If your exam is in 3 months and you're triggered by anxiety now, then the trigger is really imaginary if you think about it, because the exam hasn't happened yet. The possibility of you failing is just that, a possibility. So it's not something that's real. I guess a better word would be hypothetical, not imaginary. Imaginary sounds like you're making stuff up, but that's not what I mean. A trigger that is in the future or a trigger that is in the past, like a bad memory, is in a sense also imaginary because it is not taking place right now. What's taking place right now is you either remembering or fantasizing about what will happen. And this is also quite important because then also it tells us how we will approach the subject. There is no stimulus control for something that hasn't happened yet, for example, right? There are competing responses, but then there's no stimulus control. At the same time, if your trigger is in the present moment, you will deal with your thoughts about the trigger in a different way, because then you need immediate action versus, let's say, just calming down or relaxing in some way for a trigger that's imaginary. So all these dimensions can help us figure out how to deal with triggers. And at the same time, they're also very useful while we're learning about our triggers, because it gives us I guess, a system, although that might be too big of a word for what this is, but it will give you a basic sense of orientation about what triggers you and how. So how do we figure out what our triggers are? Because my previous slide kind of implies that you know what they are. And oftentimes when people come to therapy, they will already know more or less what triggers them. There are some triggers that are quite obvious, like, I don't know, intense emotion or anger, for example, or mirrors or blemishes. These things are very easy to connect. But every now and then people will come to therapy and they will say, I have no idea what triggers it. It seems completely random. And they're obviously baffled because no matter how you look at picking, whether you think it's psychological, biological, or whatever, or the combination of the two, no one ever thinks it's completely random, right? Like even our biology is not random. It works like, like a Swiss clock. It's quite precise. So it's extremely important to first understand what triggers you. I put 4 things here, um, 3 of which are related to gathering data, and then 1 refers to analyzing data. So self-observation, I put self-observation and self-monitoring, which may seem like they're the same thing, but I put them there just so that in my mind, I know what is it that I want to say. So self-observation would be developing a kind of awareness of what's happening in your mind and in your body at all times. It's kind of like cultivating a mindful attitude towards your life. That way you will be able to notice before an intense trigger. So before you feel the urge to pick, for example, you can already have several triggers preceding it. And then every trigger adds like a little bit to the urge. And then at one point, the urge escalates. So sometimes the urge will escalate for a very small thing, but the urge will be very intense. If you have all these sort of small triggers throughout your day, and you're not mindful enough, you're very likely to pass them over. And then once, let's say, the urge comes up very intense, it will really seem random. It will seem like it's exaggerated. It will seem like it's not logical. And this is because you didn't really follow its logical progression. So when I say self-observation here, I mean paying attention to your thoughts, but more than that, I mean paying attention to your feelings. Because before we have thoughts such as, oh, this is the urge to pick, or even, anxious thoughts, we usually have tension somewhere in our bodies. So that would be the first step to identifying your triggers, is to kind of start from the body, because that's where the subtlest signs usually are. Then would be sort of a more wider awareness than that. That would mean learning how to observe your thoughts, and learning how to observe your thoughts and emotions in the way in which they arise as you interact with other people. So it's not enough to just catch yourself anxiously ruminating over something. It's quite important that you understand sort of how the process works. Like something happens, then you have a thought and a feeling, they interact in some strange way, and then you respond to that situation. So developing awareness means becoming aware of this whole arc. Because if you really want to change things, then you can't just remove all the triggering events, right? You kind of have to work with the trigger both practically in real life, but then also psychologically. And then by self-monitoring here, I mean literal collection of data in the sense of walked into the bathroom, felt the urge while I was looking out, out the window, for example. So that would be more about sort of observing the external urges. Because if you pay attention to what I was just saying, learning the external part is just one half of the story, and then learning the internal part is the other half of the story. But you need both to fully understand how the urges function. And then I usually advise people to either use our app because it's free and you don't have to be in the program, so you can just download it, or create a spreadsheet for yourself, or use a journal. If you like to journal, I always encourage people to do that because I think journaling is quite helpful. And then, so you gather the data. Let's say for my clients, I usually ask them to do that weekly, but that's not necessary. You can review the data once in 2 weeks or wherever you like, depending on how much you gather. So basically you just write it down day to day, moment to moment, as you notice things that trigger you to a certain extent. And then every once in a while, you review everything that you write down. And then first what you do is you isolate what would be the most obvious external triggers. Then you isolate the thoughts that are related to the triggers. And then you isolate the emotions that are related to triggers. And then you have the basic 3 components, one after the other. And then what you try doing is when you look at the thoughts, try seeing what is the pattern that's repeating itself. When it comes to emotions, try figuring out what the pattern is. And then obviously when it comes to external triggers, try seeing what the pattern is. In my experience, not every category always seems logical. Sometimes it will be very easy to isolate a pattern of thoughts, for example, and for other people, it will be emotions, and for someone else, it will be the external events. You can start with whatever makes most sense to you, and then simply sort of cluster things based on what you can classify and try to to, as you gather more and more data, try to find order in all three of them because they're usually connected. The way that it works is that there's always something that makes us feel a certain way, and there are feelings and there are thoughts, and they all tend to influence each other. They kind of cooperate together in creating the mess that our psyche is. So when you learn about triggers and when you gather data and analyze them, you learn to differentiate these three, and you learn to understand how they work together. This all maybe sounds very simple and easy when I say it, but it's really not that easy to do. Uh, Discovering triggers is something that in the Skin Peak program we do for at least 2 weeks and sometimes even more. And people usually don't like this first part of the program. They're very annoyed by it because the therapist can guide you and ask questions, but ultimately most of the work is something that you have to do. This is tedious data collect. It's like, this is how I imagine accountants working, like people who just kind of look at these small numbers and think this is what discovering triggers really is. It's like, or like a certain kind of archaeology, when they have a brush and they kind of move the brush around to discover nothing in 7 hours. That is exactly what it feels like to discover triggers. So don't get discouraged, especially if you have difficulties identifying your emotions. This process is very likely to be difficult for you, but it is extremely important because whatever else you do will be based on triggers. If you want to use habit reversal, you need to know what your triggers are, because how on earth are you going to prevent yourself from picking if you're not able to recognize when it's about to happen, right? By anticipating your triggers. So in that sense, they're mandatory. If you want to go deeper and understand what picking is all about, you still have to start with something. And triggers, thoughts, and emotions are really that something, because that's the basic material that we have to work with. So even though this seems easy, it is not easy. So be patient with yourself and take it slowly. So now let's see, why is it that triggers trigger us? So as always, if this is your first webinar, then you don't know who the man on the right is. If this is not your first webinar, you've seen him every time, I think. This is George Kelly. He created a system of psychology and psychotherapy called personal construct psychology, or as I call it, constructivist psychology. So in constructivist psychology, a trigger is never just a trigger. To, the famous Freud's saying that a cigar is sometimes just a cigar. Well, in constructivism, a cigar is never just a cigar. It's at least two things at every given moment. So for Kelly, everything that you can see, so everything around you is obviously exactly what it is. Like a chair is a chair, you are you, and all that. So everything is what it is. So this slide is exactly what it is. But at the same time, this slide is also what it means to me. So we have elements and then we have constructs. It's like constructs are like sort of baskets that we keep our elements in. I mean, in our heads, right? So when you take one element, one trigger, that trigger is whatever you identify it as, plus the basket that it's in. And this is very important. It's kind of like when you listen to music. Let's say a song that I like, Thunder Road, Bruce Springsteen's song, just one of my favorite songs of all times. So we can all hear that song and we will all agree, yeah, sure, this is, Springsteen's song. But what that song for me is not just any Springsteen song, because he has songs that I really don't like. Not many, but they exist, right? So it's that plus what it means to me, what I feel when I hear the song, what I think about when I hear the song, what memories it triggers, what is it basically that I read into the song. Only from my subjective point of view, I'm not reading into anything. That is exactly what that song is and nothing else. So how we construe something and the thing in itself, they kind of overlap. And we're really never able to disentangle that entirely. And this is very important to understand, because this is where we can find the answer to why triggers trigger us. So we have elements and then we have constructs. And we never have just one construct, because that would be really simple, right? So we have many of them. And all these constructs are kind of connected to each other. And it's in this interlinking between these constructs that we find meaning. And then meaning consequently determines how we deal with different things. The reason why some people are scared of, I don't know, scary movies, and why some people aren't, isn't that some people have, I don't know, nervous systems that don't react to certain things. It's that they mean different things to us. You can also see that like when you're little and when you grow up, because your view of the world shifts when you're young and you watch a horror movie. Uh, I remember there was one horror movie, I cannot remember the name, but I saw it once when my parents weren't around and I was sort of flipping through TV channels. I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And I remember to this day, it's like one of those 80s horror movies, those with like $7 budgets. And then I remember this scene that this boy dies and his friends are really very sorry. And then one of them was very smart and he kind of turned him into some sort of half human, half robot something. And that kind of made him alive, but had no human feelings. And then he started sort of seeking vengeance on people who, somehow harmed him while he was alive. And I remember, so there's one scene that I kind of stumbled upon when I was watching it, where he's killing this old lady with a basketball. It's really gruesome and bloody. I was terrified of it when I was little. I couldn't sleep, and I remember like for months afterwards, every time I hear something in the bushes outside, I would think, "Oh my God, that's it! Someone created a cyborg, and this is the end of me." And then when I was in medical school, one night I saw this on one of those channels that show old movies all the time. It was such a piece of crap that I have no words to explain to you. And it's the same person, well, more or less the same person watching, but now it means something completely different. So what used to terrify me when I was little now had no impact on me. I just saw it and I thought, my God, this is so cheesy. Could they pack in any more tropes in this 90-minute movie? So this is sort of what things mean to us determines how we will treat them. Or in slightly simpler words, pardon the exclusionary language, but this was written a while ago. I mean, like a couple of thousand years ago. So Seneca said that a person is affected not by events, but by the view that they take of them. And this is very, very famous. Epictetus has something similar, and anyone who's ever been to CBD has probably heard this in one form or another. So this is essentially why triggers are triggers. It's because of what they mean to us, not what they are in and of themselves. Like a mirror is just a mirror and that's it. But it's what it means to us and it's the function that it performs in our life that really makes it a trigger. So let's complicate this just a little more. I hope you're following me up to this point. If not, ask anything and I will be happy to clarify. When it comes to Kelly, I'm always happy to clarify anything. So when I explained it like this, it's kind of simple. So it's what it means to me, not what it really is, right? But it's not that simple because, like I said, we don't have one construct. We have several of them. We have dozens of them, uh, maybe even more, who knows? And they're not all the same. So not every construct is as important. Meaning is kind of hierarchical. We see this in society as well, not just inside our heads as well. And it's kind of like this pyramid here. And then on top of the pyramid are the most important constructs. So these are your values. This is why when we work in the second part of the program, we also talk about values because ultimately these core constructs, as Kelly calls them, is what it all kind of comes down to. When you move towards the base of the pyramid, the constructs become very particular. So when you go up, they become abstract, like freedom, love, family, community, these kind of big things. And then when you go down, they become more practical, like you move towards the elements. And then those blocks on the very bottom of the pyramid are basically like the elements. For example, a mirror would be, as a trigger, would be somewhere in the bottom of the pyramid because it's very particular. Now, we can obviously observe and give meaning to and differentiate between thousands and thousands. So our pyramid has a very large base of these particular things, and not all of them will be triggers, and all of them will have some meaning. Some meaning will be more important, some less important, right? So that means that what's an element on the bottom is an element of the construct somewhere above, then that construct is an element of the construct above, and that's how it works. You kind of climb up the pyramid. Sometimes, let's say, I don't know, let's say if I have a mug that I like very much, and I break that mug, or I lose something. Like recently, I lost a photo of my sister when she was little that I liked very much, and there's no copy of that photograph. So I was really very sad. But that, so the photograph would be somewhere in the bottom. It's like a specific concrete object, right? And then I was sad, but I wasn't shaken up. Like, it's not like I was crying and rolling around on the floor. So the meaning didn't really go all the way to the top of the pyramid. It stopped somewhere, let's say, in the middle. When it comes to triggers, you basically have an element that lives here on the bottom of the pyramid, and then it has like VIP access to the very top. And this is exactly why it's a trigger, because it goes all the way up. Sometimes when in therapy we start talking about who you are as a person, people will say, yeah, but what does that have to do with this? This is what triggered me. And so it's very important for us to go as far up as we can so that we can understand why is it that something will trigger you. Um, I had a conversation earlier today with a cousin of mine who he was talking about his work and how he really doesn't like his boss and how his boss always gives him a hard time. And so the more we talked about that, the more it seemed to me that his boss is really just like my cousin writes a report and then his boss sends it, annotated with all kinds of comments and remarks. So in my mind, that's not even being critical. Like it's literally the man's job to review your report and then to tell you what to change. You change it and then you're done and that's it. So for me, this really doesn't have any particular meaning. I might be annoyed that I have to do it, but that's about it. But for my cousin, bring him back like a report with, how when you use track changes, then like half of the page becomes red. Do that to him. And for him, that's a huge invalidation because it goes all the way to the top of the pyramid. For me, it gets lost like somewhere in the basic steps there because I really don't measure my value on how well I write reports. I mean, I already know I don't write them well because I hate writing them. So I just don't care. Whereas for my cousin, it really kind of affects a part of his identity. So for him, that's extremely triggering because it basically tells him that, he's really bad at his job. Even though his boss never said that, probably doesn't mean it. But in my cousin's head, this is exactly where it links all the way up to the top, where he has to be good at his job and now he sees himself as bad. Right, so triggers are usually very specific things. That was the point of this slide, that somehow connect to the very top of who we are as people, or how we see ourselves anyway, how we would like to be as people. And for me, this is where Kelly takes few steps ahead of any sort of CBT approach, is this kind of subtlety that he gives us, because every construct has two ends. So then we know exactly what it means if you don't do it and exactly what it means if you do it. And then we can sort of plot change in a more systematic way afterwards. So the key question in determining why is something a trigger for you is, what does this mean to me? Because you will treat it in accordance to what it means to you. So to give you another example, which is related to skin picking more than my cousin, clients are often triggered by potential conflict. So it will be an imaginary trigger. So it doesn't even happen yet, might not even happen, but just the thought that you might end up in an argument with someone is triggering. So this triggers them because disagreement potentially leads to rejection. For some people, this could mean, after all, you are not really that good. You're just not good enough. So a conflict wouldn't be triggering if it didn't mean that you're not good enough. If we look at what it means for the top of the pyramid of that person, it would mean that, being a good boy, good son, good, I don't know, father, husband, whatever, is core for them. I see you raising your hand, so please type in the questions and I will come back to them. So conflict wouldn't be a trigger if it didn't mean you're not good enough. For example, I don't mind conflict at all because for me, that's a chance to get to know someone usually, because it's usually when we fight about something that we really get to know the other person. Because wherever our values agree, we just assume we're the same. And this is where you actually get to know the person. But then again, I don't see conflicts as me not being good enough. I just see it as a difference of opinion. And then when we change the meaning of something, we change the way we react, or rather something is no longer a trigger. I gave you an example with a horror movie that used to terrify me. Then I saw it with slightly more grown-up eyes and I thought, and what kind of a garbage is this? I'm not going to waste my time doing this. So the shift that we have to make is ultimately always psychological. This is why I said in the beginning that even though for practical purposes of getting to know our triggers and understanding them on a very basic level, the division to internal and external triggers is really very significant. But then ultimately, every external trigger is also internal, is primarily internal because it's about what it means to us. Also, our memories that we have. Some memories will be terribly triggering for us because of what they mean to us. Otherwise, our brains remember all kinds of stuff, but we don't get triggered by all of it because not all of it means the same thing to us, right? So I'm going to show you four different works of art, and this will, I hope, illustrate this principle a little bit better. I will ask you to observe what you think and how you're feeling as I'm showing you these, because I will explain what is it that other people found triggering, and then what is it that the artist wanted the work to represent, so that you can see how, at least in my mind, some of these things that were maybe gross before, once you kind of understand the ideas behind them, they shift slightly. So let's start. Take a look at this. It's a high resolution picture, so just look at it very carefully. It's a sculpture by Mark Quinn. It's called Self. He makes one of these every 5 years or so, and this was, I believe, the first one. So when this work was revealed, it was met with quite a lot of outrage, and critics were very much divided, and audiences were almost universally appalled by it. And so if you don't, I guess you can't see why, but so what he did was he created a cast of his head using some sort of silicone, and then he put his own blood into the silicone. So what you see is in effect a blood sculpture. So he would slowly over time, drain his own blood, put it in the silicone, and then freeze it. And then this is the resulting structure. So it may not look as gross like this, but imagine in real life standing in front of a blood sculpture, right? Doesn't smell particularly nice, looks gruesome. People were very much upset by it. And it really does trigger a lot of people, even when you don't know what it is. So I've shown this picture to people and they would just look and say, what is it? It looks disgusting. And disgust is generally, I think, the reaction that people have to it. And obviously I understand why. So now just take a moment and then sort of see what you feel when you look at it. Now I'll explain to you what the author's intention was, and then you'll see if it means the same thing. So obviously, this has to be kept very cold. There are things inside of it that sort of keep it frozen. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a sculpture, it would be, I don't know, crime scene. So it has to be continuously kept in the frozen state for it to actually remain a sculpture. When he made this sculpture, Mark Quinn was struggling with alcoholism, and it was apparently a very serious struggle. So when he made the sculpture, he wanted to illustrate what the nature of dependency is and what the nature of addiction is, which is that for his own existence, alcohol was necessary. He wouldn't be able to function, to be who he is without alcohol. This sculpture is unable to function and unable to sustain its form without whatever it's keeping it cold. In the moment when that goes away, the sculpture melts and it doesn't exist. And this is exactly how he felt about his alcohol use, which is that the alcohol is the only thing that kept him in place. Without alcohol, he would fall apart. And that's exactly why that addiction was so debilitating. And blood as the choice of the medium for someone who is an alcoholic and as something that is really fundamental to our existence, I think it paints a slightly different picture. I think when you look at a blood sculpture, you can think, my God, what a bizarre is this? But when you hear this story, I think we can all relate to this struggle with depending on something or someone. You don't have to even be a drug addict or or struggle with alcoholism to understand the ambivalence and the difficulty of being dependent on someone. I mean, on a very banal level, try being without your phone for 24 hours, right? In this day and age. Try being without your partner's support. Try being without skin picking, you know. So this may look gross and gruesome and disgusting, but when you sort of step into his shoes, I think this sculpture has something really profound to say. And it may have triggered you, but for him, it was a part of a healing process, actually. So let's see something that's slightly easier to look at. This is a very famous painting, right? It's the Impressions of the Sunrise by Monet. And now you might think, how could this possibly trigger anyone or anything? Because Impressionism is like the most, I think of all the art, most people would say that Impressionists were the kindest to our eye. It's very pleasant to look at. It makes you feel all kinds of lovely, fuzzy feelings. It has these pleasant colors. It's just lovely. Like it's something to put on, something to, it's like what we put on our walls. It's what we like, to have on our refrigerator magnets. It's just everywhere. How can this possibly be triggering? However, when Impressionism showed up, it was quite radical, and it was described as such. And in fact, this painting, when it was first shown in the first exhibition of Impressionists, received very bad reviews. Monet was, I think, the most criticized of the Impressionists at the time. They were all not very loved, but he was really criticized by art critics because they were shocked by this. To them, this wasn't even painting. One critic wrote that he didn't know whether or not Monet was actually a good painter because he didn't exhibit a single painting. He just exhibited preliminary sketches for paintings, which is what this is supposed to be, in his opinion. So for a lot of people, Impressionists completely redefined the way they look at the world. Like this was unnerving to people. And when we look at it, we look at something really nice, something that if you, I don't know, own a corporation can afford to put on your wall, or just use a poster like other people. But so something that when we look at it with contemporary eyes, we see something really nice and comforting. For people, this was a radical departure from before. Like if you remember your art history, what came before was basically that academic style of painting that emphasized technical perfection and realistic painting of human figures and whatnot. So this is almost barbaric to them. It's anxiety inducing. And when we look at it to relax. So that's also one difference, how historical context shifts. And then the meaning that we attribute to works of art also changes. And the same thing goes for our personal meaning. What triggered us before might not trigger us right now. And if you look at your history with triggers, I'm sure that you will notice that some triggers may have remained constant, others have changed. Or at least they trigger you in a different way, more or less, and so on. And then one of my favorite artists, I mention her quite often. So this is a photo of Marina Abramovic, the performance artist. This is not from the Rhythm O because I couldn't find any pictures from that performance. This is from The Artist is Present, but both were triggering to people in different ways. Rhythm O, however, or Rhythm Zero rather, is really one of those great works of art that will, I think, be remembered for centuries to come. It was a rather simple performance, and she really didn't do anything. Literally, she was just standing there, and she wasn't saying or wasn't doing anything. So it was in the mid-70s in Naples, in Italy, in a small gallery. So she was just standing dressed like very informally, and next to her there was a table with different kinds of objects on the table. The instructions for people who came to the gallery were very simple. The instruction was do whatever you want. To the artist, with the artist, she's just standing there. And so when people first came in, they were a little bit shy and didn't know quite what to do. So they would like look at her, walk around, look at the objects on the table. And then as time went by, they would sort of became more free to experiment. So they started playing with her hair, moving her clothes, like touching her face or touching her body rather inappropriately, as she said later on. And then they got even more free. So they started ripping her clothes off, cutting her hair. There was a rose on the table, and then someone took the rose and took a thorn off of it and then scratched her body with it. And then eventually it all escalated when someone took a loaded gun and put it on her forehead. She hadn't moved the whole time, and even with the gun pointed at her head, she still didn't move. And the police eventually interrupted the performance. I mean, if nothing else, then I guess to save her life. And this caused quite an outrage when it was first performed. And of course, she would never perform it again. And I guess she even said a few times this is the most dangerous thing she had ever done. People thought she was crazy, and she was very heavily criticized. Like, this is too much for an artwork. Like, is this woman insane? What is this? But to me, this is one of the most powerful works of art that I guess I haven't seen it in 1974. I was but a faint idea. But just reading about it makes me really impressed. For me, she's not the crazy one. I think people are very triggered by a profound truth that this performance sort of tells about us, which is that even the like sort of normal everyday people who go around visiting galleries for fun on their day off can become vicious killers. Just give them some time and freedom. And to me, this is really terrifying because this means that that person who almost pulled the trigger and killed her is possibly me or all of you. It's a terrifying idea if you think about it. But then, because this is a very hard truth to look at, I have to admit it's terrifying for me as well. And I've spent many years in therapy to become a therapist. And I can imagine that it's much easier to say, well, this woman's just crazy. It's her, it's not me. Because then you can turn her into the one who's doing something wrong instead of us not wanting to look at what the performance really stirred up in us. It's disturbing. But it's disturbing not because she did something weird. In fact, she was really brave. It's because we all recognize that potential, that breaking boundaries step by step. That's every step seems so small, but then you go so far and you forget what's normal. To me, that's what the performance was about. The picture here is from The Artist is Present from like 2012, I think. It's that famous performance at MoMA where people were standing in line for days to see her, where she was just sitting on a chair and then you could sit across from her and look her in the eyes. I remember someone sent me when she was performing this, because this took a few months to perform. Someone sent me a clip of it was Megyn Kelly, and she was still at Fox News back then. She threw a tantrum on TV over the performance, how upset she was. She basically, she ended up yelling at the camera, this is not art, this is just some crazy Yugoslav lady sitting there. She's just sitting there. It was really funny to me because I understand that to many people, performance is borderline not art. Of course, I personally think, of course it is. And to me, it's very interesting as an art form. But I know that for a lot of people, it might not seem like art. But what Megyn Kelly in that situation did, and many other people, she's just the one I remember, but people were really shocked by that, even though she was really just sitting. To me, the solution to that is not to say this is not art, but to engage with it. And maybe you don't like it as art. For example, to be perfectly honest, I really don't like Impressionism. There's one Impressionist maybe that I actually like, not even among the most famous ones. I dislike that style of painting. But it's not that I kind of had to learn about Impressionism before I decided that I don't like it. But when we find something that triggers us so intensely, like the crazy Yugoslav lady just sitting in the gallery, what most people do is they keep on projecting instead of engaging with it. So we kind of stay trapped in our own minds. You can engage and still not like it, and that's fine, but you will understand why it's art. But instead, if your solution is to just scream, this is not art, this is not art, this is just some crazy lady, then you're in your own head. And this is exactly what we do with triggers. Because they mean so much to us, it's very hard to step aside and look at them from a different perspective. And that's exactly at the same time what we need to change. Like, there's no amount of art theory or art history that will convince, I don't know, Megyn Kelly that Marina Abramović is an artist. But sitting there across from her and letting her guard down and looking her, directly in her eyes might actually change her mind. Because witnessing performance art is not the same thing as reading about it. It's the experience that will change ultimately what it means for everyone involved. I hope that that was clear there, that when something triggers us, we tend to retreat into our head and what it means to us and then kind of reinforce the trigger instead of stepping aside and seeing it from a different perspective. And then here's an example that's maybe the most unbelievable of them all. So this is Judizio Universale, the Last Judgment from the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo. And this was also quite a triggering painting for many people when it was finished. It was commissioned by one pope. I believe it was one of the Clements, but maybe the seventh. My high school was a long time ago, so I don't remember exactly. I'm sure it was a Clement, but there's like many of them since popes have like 3 names. So it was Clement something. And so he liked it and he was very happy with it. But then Clement was a pope for a very short period of time. And then he died and he was, another pope was elected. It was Paul, one of the early Pauls, like second, third, something like that. Never mind. So it was Pope Paul. And so Pope Paul really did not like this. In fact, he was quite upset over it. And there were many things that he didn't like. So most obviously, if you look at the painting, you'll see a lot of nudity on it. And he really didn't want any penises dangling around his church. And he thought that was very disrespectful and not very Christian. And he was really genuinely upset by that. And in fact, a lot of people were. And this caused something that was called a fig leaf campaign at the time, meaning that they had this whole movement. You know, if they had Twitter, the chaos that would ensue, we cannot even imagine. Hashtag fig leaf. Basically what they did was kind of pressure Michelangelo to dress them up a little bit. So if you see a lot of the figures are draped, especially like here on the right side, on the left, there's basically just one naked man where you can actually see his genitals because people just couldn't look at it. Not in the context of religion, especially, and not in any context. It was considered to be extremely offensive because back then, so this is the 16th century, back then people used to be born with their clothes on. This is a little known fact, but when babies would be born, they would already be wrapped up. So no one ever knew that people had penises and women had vaginas. So that was like just a new thing then, and they were really outraged by it. I have to engage in a little bit of historical gossip, and then I will go back to my point. The same Pope, Paul, who was outraged by seeing naked men painted on the wall, also had illegitimate children. So, one could say it's hypocritical, but yeah, one could. So that was one thing they didn't like. The second thing they didn't like is the way that everyone was painted, especially Jesus and Mary. If you look at the painting very closely, you see that Jesus here is a muscular man. Like he's very much in his body. And that's quite a big body as well. And he has no beard. And if you remember how, before the Renaissance, how religious figures were painted, especially like if you compare this to like Byzantine art, where Jesus is almost anorexic and you can see his whole rib cage, and he always has a beard. This is a completely different person, and it seemed pagan to them. Of course, it seemed pagan because it was influenced by pagan art, obviously, but it was considered almost like a mockery of religion. Today, of course, The Last Judgment was one of the great works of Western art. I don't think many people, I really cannot imagine anyone that would be genuinely upset by seeing this. In fact, if you go to a museum, any museum, you're likely to see dozens of naked bodies. There were some other paintings of naked bodies that I thought about putting, but then I realized that we were already talking about a difficult subject and that putting certain French painters here would really be too much. So I really don't want to upset people. But art history has seen a lot worse afterwards. And we generally today don't really mind seeing naked sculptures. We don't have to put fig leaves on them or paintings, and we don't have to cover them up and drape them. Right. So when in a different historical context, the meaning of this completely changed. This is still in the Sistine Chapel today. People see it, they pray there. So no one considered it sacrilegious in any way. But back then, it was a very big deal. Like in the Renaissance, you did not want to upset the Pope. The higher the number, the stricter the Pope. So in that sense, it was extremely triggering to people because seeing a naked body was horrible to them. Today, we look at this and we say, my God, this is just beautiful, right? And it's the historical context that has changed. It's not that today we're really very comfortable with naked bodies. I mean, really, we're not. We tend to go in extremes, which tells you that we're really not very comfortable with it. Because as soon as we have to divide ourselves into very extreme positions on anything, it really typically means that we're not very comfortable with it. We just have to find one niche where everything is black or white, right? When it comes to art, we have a lot more complexity in the way we look at it today, I suppose, than we did back then. So this is not triggering anymore because it's not that our morals have fundamentally changed, because I don't think, even if you're Catholic or Christian in general, I don't think you'd find this very triggering. And the morals are more or less the same as they were, at least the basic tenets are. So it's that the context has shifted. Artwork has a different place for us today. We're much more likely to be outraged over an article somewhere online or some crap that shows up in our Facebook feed. This is because no one goes to church 7 days a week anymore and doesn't have to look at naked people. Now we're upset over naked people somewhere else. So when the context shifts, the meaning of certain elements also changes. We still might be upset by naked bodies, but we're upset by them if they show up on television. But when we have them in churches, we're fine. I think this says a lot about sort of how our culture is changing. It's the same element, naked human body, in different contexts, completely different meaning. I mean, just look at this. Like, how much of this would be, TV friendly? Almost none of it. Okay, so hopefully here you understand how meaning shapes triggers and how and sort of how we interact actually with meaning with our own heads and not with the external world. So we're going to talk about two little things, and then we will move on to the Q&A part. One thing is going to be about triggers and avoidance. And then the second one about triggers and anxiety. And the second one, this one might be clear to you, but the second point is, I think, very important. And if there's anything that you can take away from this webinar, I hope it's the last point. So when I mentioned in the beginning that I found an article about sort of whether or not people should put trigger warnings on art. I mean, obviously, I guess by now you understand that it's completely beside the point for skin picking. It's just an article that came up on Google. But anyway, because I couldn't find any literature on the subject, I sort of, how you read the article and then you just look at one comment and then you end up reading 87 of them. And that's exactly what I did. And I found one description of what it feels like to be triggered by art. And I thought it was really similar to something I had read the same day, only at work. So here you go. When triggered, you feel awful. You can't focus, your heart races, and in severe cases, you think you're going to just break down. So this is a part of one of the comments from the article. And then on the same day, I read something that a client of mine wrote. So look at this. I thought I would fail the exam. My palms were sweating and I couldn't breathe, and I thought I would either pick all of it or die. So just remove the part, sort of pick, and you get more or less the same description, right? Except that picking here shows up as a solution to the state of being triggered. The commenter in the first quote that I put, he just sort of thinks he's going to break down, but he obviously either doesn't need or doesn't have the tools to deal with it. Whereas a person that picks, well, my client knew. She knew I feel like I'm going to die, so I'm just going to pick. So that means that picking actually deals with the excitation, with the reaction to being triggered. So even here you can see how trigger has very little to do with what triggers us and everything to do with what happens in our internal world. Picking here is flat out a solution to the state of arousal that occurred for my client. It doesn't mean that it's a healthy solution. I just have to kind of emphasize that. If we're not able to tolerate our own emotional responses, especially when they're vague and intense, like the ones described here, we tend to distract ourselves or to retreat. Skin picking is obviously one such strategy. By skin picking, if you want to learn more about this, we had a webinar on avoidance and skin picking, so you're welcome to find that on YouTube. Anyway, so skin picking is obviously one way in which we avoid dealing with our emotions. Sometimes it's a way to kind of convert, and I use that term loosely, like to convert this excitation into an act, into an action, and then release the tension that your body is creating, which you cannot bear to be with. And then at other times, there's this element where the physical pain of picking kind of overshadows the unbearable psychological pain. Because I don't know why, but sometimes people seem to think that physical pain is preferable. It kind of snaps you out of the psychological distress. So that's one way. This way, we cope with the triggering situation as it is unfolding or after it has unfolded. This is one strategy. Then the other strategy is to try to avoid triggers altogether, right? So basically eliminate anything that that upsets you, that makes you feel any sort of discomfort, and so on. Just get it out of your life. And then this is where I think my wires crossed with the article, because the articles was basically discussing whether or not in museums you should have trigger warnings in certain rooms about what might potentially trigger someone who might be sensitive to something, right? So I don't know exactly how you would formulate that list, but anyway, that reminded me of this, where sometimes, so I was reading the debate under, in the article, and then some people just propose that certain things are obviously triggering to everyone and they shouldn't really be portrayed in art, or people should be warned against certain things that will trigger most people, if not everyone. And then there's kind of this theme of whether or not we should ever really feel discomfort that was going on beneath it. It's obviously not the same thing as skin picking, and I'm not making a complete equivalency. But what is similar is this idea that somehow discomfort is bad. And this is where I understand, obviously, that someone feels very uncomfortable looking at a piece of art or feeling any emotion anywhere. But for example, for me as a person, I like it when art provokes me and makes me feel all kinds of uncomfortable things. Like the performance that I described, Marina Abramovich's The Dangerous performance, Rhythm Zero, that really makes me feel very uneasy. But I like that because I feel that it's, for me, art is kind of safe uneasy, because I know that I'm working through something that's very, difficult and complicated and unpleasant. But because it's a work of art, it's not any actual situation in life, I kind of feel protected. So for me, to have art trigger me in all kinds of ways, I'm always up for it because I feel that it's safe for me. But in general in life, we almost feel like we should never really be upset, right? So then we tend to eliminate what we cannot bear to look at and what makes us feel uncomfortable. When we start doing this, as a consequence, our world shrinks, right? So let's say, whoops, something popped up. Sorry. So let's say that that you don't like, you're triggered by nudity, since we already had Michelangelo's example there. If your solution to that is never to walk into a museum or never watch any movie that features any kind of nudity, then your world will be smaller as a consequence. Of course, not every reduction in the size of our world is necessarily bad, but my point is that if we eliminate everything that triggers us, then our world really becomes very small. Let's say that conflicts trigger you to pick, and then you decide to resolve the situation by avoiding any kind of conflict at all. How happy would you be actually in relationships if you have to concede any disagreement in advance? How much space would there be for you actually? How well would people know you? Let's say that you're triggered by, I don't know, public speaking is one of the things that I listed in the beginning. If you have meetings at work, like how well will your career go if you just shut everything out that makes you anxious? And now we come to what I think is the point. When we do that, when we eliminate elements from our life and make our world smaller as a consequence, we call that constriction in constructivist psychology, because you constrict your world. The opposite of that is dilation. So it's when you make your world bigger. Neither of these two is either good or bad. So it's all about how you use them. Sometimes people can leave a lot of things out. For example, during COVID and in the past year, I've noticed that some of my clients who felt very comfortable in their constricted little worlds weren't really very affected by the pandemic, psychologically speaking, because they weren't affected by the travel ban. Travel ban, it's a bit of extreme, but like, well, it is a travel ban, I guess, in a sense, because we really can't travel like we did before or at all, because they really never traveled anywhere in the first place. So when you constrict your world to a smaller degree, then some things just don't bother you. On the other hand, most people have to have a certain level of dilation in their world. Some people maybe can do without traveling, but most people cannot do without traveling or seeing their friends or hugging their friends and so on. So there's also a lot of suffering in constriction. In some ways it's useful, in some ways it's not useful. And then we tend to dilate because we want new experiences. It's kind of like when we were trapped in the same freaking room for a year now. Um, you obviously want to do something, explore the world. You want dilation. But in psychological terms, when we want to expand our world, we have to get new constructs, basically. If you remember, like we need new baskets for new elements. When we go out into the world and we don't have baskets, what we feel is anxiety. Anxiety always follows new experiences. In fact, that is exactly how we know that they're new, because they make us anxious. Anxiety is a way for your mind and your body to tell you, hello, this is something new. You need to see what this is, find a basket for it, and then figure out how to deal with it. So from a constructivist point of view, anxiety arises precisely where our constructs end. When you cannot predict and assign meaning, and when you don't know then consequently what to do about something, this is where you become anxious. So anxiety is an invitation to elaborate your world, not to run away from it. Because that is the way we see things in constructivism and also in any kind of CBT, it's rather similar. There is really no change without anxiety. Change by definition is doing something differently than what you did before. So if you're not willing to put up with some anxiety, then you can't change. When avoidance is our response to triggering situations, we either pick or constrict our world. And by doing that, we actually reinforce our triggers. Because the more you avoid something, you're less focused on what is it that you're actually trying to avoid. So you're less focused on the element and you're more focused on the construct, so to speak. So you're trapped in your head, basically. And then you don't really look at what's triggering anxiety. The less you look at it, the less shape it has, right? Because it becomes this kind of mass of undifferentiated events, all of which make you feel uncomfortable or whatever else, right? And then the scarier they look. And then the scarier they look, the more anxiety they provoke. So by avoiding, we're actually amplifying what triggers us. The only way out of something triggering us is through it. That doesn't mean that you have to expose yourself to the most anxiety-inducing situation in the world. God, no, that's not always healthy and it's not useful. I will tell you in just a minute how to approach it, but there is no way around it. There's only way through it. And this is, I think, maybe the most important thing that I wanted to share with you today. That avoidance patterns always reinforce triggers. So we have to look at them really very carefully so that they stop making us anxious. So what to do with them overall? We can basically sum up everything that I was saying in these 5 steps. First, you have to identify your triggers, like on this basic level. So what are they? Without too much psychology, just to sort of identify what they are. Then you have to add the first layer, which is to understand how they make you feel, what they make you think. If thoughts are triggers, then obviously what they make you think is not relevant here, right? Then you need to understand what are the themes that are repeating themselves, or rather, what is it that they mean to you? What is it that they link into? Like what's on the top of the pyramid that they're in, to understand what they mean, right? And you need to understand what's the opposite of what they mean. And if you're one of my clients, you know that I will sometimes ask you, when you say, this makes me feel, I don't know, disgusted, I will ask you what's the opposite of disgust, because every construct has 2 sides. So we need to know both sides. And then when we know these both sides, we have to kind of rotate the axis. We have to take what's useful from both of them and create new meaning. Or rather, I guess a way to put it is to reframe the conversation. But when we reframe it, we do it in such a way that we get new practical tips. So for example, I was recently working with a client who, it was not a client from SkinPix, it was a different, obviously, problem and a client. And so essentially he was torn between his family and his work, because he was extremely ambitious at work and he really also valued family. And then there came a point where he had 3 kids and his wife was really overwhelmed and he wasn't able to help at home at all. And at work, he would be sort of distracted and not focused enough. And then we talked about this a little bit and it seemed like he doesn't want to give up either of these. And then when we formulated what that means, It means that he's basically every day when he wakes up, he's choosing whether or not he's going to be a bad father or a bad worker, a bad employee at work. Both of these things were sort of on the top of the pyramid for him, and he wasn't able to let go of either. And there was guilt, whatever you do. So it was terribly difficult. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of guilt, a lot of dread. So, how did we find new meaning? One thing that I try to do with him is to introduce context, which is the first thing that I always do. And you can always introduce context in terms of what's realistic when you set goals, but also in terms of your internal context, which is what is it you actually need. Sometimes we live with goals and values that were assigned to us or given to us or that we chose, a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And then as our life changes, we don't really update them. So I tried to take this route with my client, and he realized that he does love his job, but there are parts of his job that he really doesn't like. And then what we did was try to kind of differentiate what is it that he finds fulfilling and meaningful and what is it he doesn't. And then we started finding ways for him to give up on what he doesn't find meaningful. Obviously, it was kind of connected to one another, but it was much easier for him to approach it that way. And so by saying no to certain things at work, now not because he's not an ambitious man, so he's not a bad businessman, he's just a selective businessman. And then when we kind of reframed what it means to be good at your job as doing what you do well, so you can still be selective about what you choose to do, and you can still then do it in a very good way with a lot of quality and whatever, something that was kind of very specific to him. I can't go into details, obviously. And by doing this, by reframing how he sees himself at work, we kind of had to maintain the ambition. We had to maintain his standards, but he was able to let go of the amount of work. Because simply, I basically cornered him, but I said, well, you can't have quality and quantity. So you have to decide which one you want. And then he said, well, okay, quality. And then he kind of reduced his work to something else and continued to do it in the same way. But he set some more time apart to spend with his kids, which sort of eased his guilt there. So the experiment was to actually set boundaries, and the meaning was when we changed the quality quantity thing at work. So you find a new way to frame the situation, then you design a little experiment that will allow you to check whether or not that works for you. All of these are very anxiety inducing. So obviously when you choose an experiment, you choose something that you can possibly do at the time. You don't really want to overwhelm yourself, but there is no change without anxiety, because whenever you try to do something new, if you remember the last slide, that's where anxiety will be, because it is something new and you still don't have any ways to deal with it. When you test out new meaning, new constructs, you see whether or not they fit. If they fit, if they did their job, then next time there will be less anxiety when you use them again. And then fifth time, there will be no anxiety. And then after every experiment, you evaluate what you did. How successful was it? In psychological terms, practical terms, and however you like. And then this is essentially how you psychologically deal with triggers. There's obviously a very down-to-earth way, how to cope with these triggers so that you don't have to pick in a particular situation. What I'm describing here is a long-term process, but a very fundamental and an important one. On a practical level, once you get to know your triggers in the way that I described in the beginning, you will be able to devise very good strategies. For how that works, check our webinar on habit reversal training. And if you're in the program, I guess you will know by now how that works. So that's all I had for you tonight, and we will go to the Q&A part. Before we do, I wanted to thank SkinPick, as always, for allowing us to meet here. You have some information about the program here. They also have a free app, and there's a free forum that you can use to share your experiences. And of course, you can use the app for self-monitoring and for identifying triggers. And if you have a therapist, you can also use the app with your therapist, and it's quite helpful. I mean, even outside of the program, because you get a lot of data and gives you statistics as well. So it does some of the analysis for you.